Welcome to Backstory with Joan Goldstein. I'm Joan Goldstein, and my guest today is a very interesting man. He is a history interpreter, I think, and his name is David Price. And David, you focused for most of your work, and you've written several books, I understand as well, on the American Revolution. And what is it that you found that was important about it and meaningful for us today, Americans today?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, Joan, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to converse with you about this subject. So I've spent the last 7 years working as a historical interpreter at Washington Crossing Historic Park. That's the Pennsylvania park that is the site of where George Washington's army crossed the Delaware River in 1776 and profoundly altered the course of the war at a moment when our quest for independence from Great Britain appeared to be on the verge of failure. So that event was really I suppose you would say the end of the beginning rather than the beginning of the end of the revolution, because the struggle continued for several more years. But what came out of it, I think, is well, I like to think of perhaps the most succinct way to express what it meant may be what Lincoln said. I'm not sure you can say it better. And if that's the case, well, it would be fitting that I think a lot of historians would say that this was articulated by our greatest president in what was probably his greatest speech at Gettysburg, where he said that in 1776, our fathers brought, in his words, brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And of course, he meant women too, in theory. Now, obviously, there was, way back then and during the period since, a significant divergence, shall we say, between practice and principle, considering that at least a third of the signers of the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. But I would like to think that in the foundational documents that they gave us, the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, they created what you might call an aspirational infrastructure that would guide our efforts towards securing a more perfect union, if you will, which we've, kind of been meandering towards gradually and often painfully so over the last 2+ decades. Or if you want to employ Dr. King's metaphor, I think it was the arc of the moral universe that he talked about. It's long, but it bends toward justice. So I'd like to think we're sort of trying to track that. And so when we talk about the meaning of the revolution, I think what we're, in a sense, we're asking probably a series of related questions that are maybe to a certain extent interchangeable. What does it mean to be an American? What does democracy mean? More specifically, what does American democracy mean? It's been a bumpy ride, but it started there. And I suppose the fact that we're even asking questions like this, that we're having a conversation like this in the public domain is really a reflection of what it means to be an American, in a sense, an outgrowth of the revolution. That is that we live in a place, fortunately, where people can have public discussions like this and even express vehement disagreements without fear of retribution from a civil authority. It all fits in with something that I read about recently from in a book by Stephen Smith, who's a political philosopher at Yale. He wrote this short book called, I don't know if you can see, it's called Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. And he says, if you'll indulge me for a second, he writes that American patriotism has in his words, a uniquely critical and self-questioning character. America may be the only country where the question, what is it to be an American, is a continual topic of discussion. To question America is not to be un-American, but part of being an American. What is American history but a series of debates over the meaning of our national identity? And then he goes on to cite the political cleavages that have existed throughout our history between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the Whigs and the Jacksonians, Lincoln and Douglas, Wilsonian internationalists and American firsters, and even today between what he refers to as multiculturalists and nationalists. So it's obviously an ongoing phenomenon, and we're still, we're still grappling with it.
I was just talking with a neighbor who is originally from Russia. And I told her about our taping coming up, and she said, but they all had slavery. She said, Russia had slavery. She said, England had slavery. So she's trying to understand why Americans think of themselves as being the only ones, or do we think of ourselves as being the only ones? Or why is it contradictory for us to be embracing slavery, considering our foundation?
I think if you go back to the Revolutionary era, there's this odd juxtaposition, obviously, that we're talking about between the widespread prevalence of slavery. It existed in every colony at the time of the Revolution, and the push for independence and liberty. But I think in a sense they almost, in a perverse sort of way, they almost go hand in hand, because and this thought is not original with me, but I think it makes a lot of sense, that the motivation on the part of our founding fathers to a large extent, to resist British, what were perceived as the onerous burdens imposed by British colonial policy, and to achieve our own right of self-governance, of political self-determination, was, in a sense, a reaction to, or at the very least, heightened by the fact that you had the institution of slavery here. That is, our founding fathers, who were advocating for liberty, could see the realities of slavery in colonial society every day. It was omnipresent. You couldn't escape it. It was more so in the South than in the North, but it was everywhere. And so they knew, in that sense, they knew what it was like to be a slave. And so you see in their writings that they refer to slavery as being the what they argue would be the fate that would befall them if they didn't resist British colonial policy. In fact, even there's a letter from George Washington, and I forget to whom he was writing this, but I think it was around 1774, 1775, when you could see that the rebellion was brewing. And in a sense, what he was writing was consistent with that theme. He to whoever the recipient was, he wrote that something to this effect, that if the Americans were to just meekly abide by or defer to the dictates that were coming from the British Parliament, that they would be subject to, or they would be being allowed, they would be allowing themselves to be treated in the same manner as the slaves. And then Washington wrote, I think this is a verbatim quote, over whom we rule with such arbitrary sway. So to that extent, I think slavery factored into the drive for revolution, because, you know, the founding fathers were saying basically, we don't want to have happen to us, we don't want the British to do to us what we've done to the Africans who were forcibly brought across the Atlantic to this country and subjected to, you know, the institution of human bondage. And of course, slavery lasted longer here than it did in Russia or in Britain, and it took a cataclysm, the bloodiest war in American history, to end it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's been written that the revolution was America's first civil war, because you had patriots and loyalists fighting each other, often members of the same family, friends, neighbors, relatives. So in that sense, the revolution was America's first civil war, and the Civil War was America's second revolution. Because in fact, James McPherson, Princeton University, wrote a book in which I think he referred to the war between the states as the Second American Revolution.
Interesting. Okay, so that gives us a perspective on our own history, doesn't it? Weren't you going to share with us a painting that was depicting Washington crossing the Delaware?
Yes, I'd like to do that. I'd like to spend some time talking about that, and I'll explain why. Let me see if I can bring it up on the screen here.
There it is.
Okay. So this is entitled Washington Crossing the Delaware by an artist named Emanuel Gottlieb Leutze. He completed it in 1851, so obviously well after the Revolution. And I like to tell, let me say, first of all, the reason why this image is so salient to me is that I see it every time I'm working at Washington Crossing Historic Park, where I'm a part-time historical interpreter. And I've been doing that for the last 7 years. So for 7 years, I've been seeing this, it's a digital replica of this work hanging over the auditorium in the visitor center. I might add parenthetically that the original is hanging at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Manhattan, which has owned the painting since 1897, although they did loan it out to the park in the 50s and 60s, but then they took it back. So when I think of the revolution, this is the image that comes to mind first and foremost. And I dare say that's probably the case for many, if not most people in this country and maybe globally. I read somewhere that this is one of the 3 most celebrated works of art in the Western world, the other 2 being by Da Vinci, the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. I always tell people when I give tours at the park that this painting is the most famous and the least accurate depiction of the event that it purports to depict.
Why is it?
And I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean, I could spend the whole show talking about the inaccuracies, but I won't do that. The artist, Leutze, I don't know whether he didn't know the details or he didn't care. He figured he wasn't going to sweat the small stuff, but clearly he was not going for technical accuracy. What he did here was to, in a sense, paint mood music. This is, and I mean this in a very positive way, this is a masterful work of political propaganda. pro-democracy propaganda. Leutze, I suppose you could say in a sense, he was a citizen of the world. He was born in Germany. He came to America as a boy in the early 19th century. Then he went back to Germany to study art, and he painted this at his studio in Dusseldorf. And then subsequent to that, he came back to America, where he spent the rest of his life. So when he painted this, or he completed it in 1851, it was in the wake of a series of democratic revolutions that had erupted in Western Europe during the preceding decade, in his native Germany, in France, in Italy, with which he was wholly in sympathy. And this was his way, I believe, of holding out the American Revolution as a template for pro-democracy movements around the globe. I believe he was inspired by those revolutionary movements in Western Europe that had occurred just a few years before. So that, in a sense, suggests that the timing of this. But the other thing for this painting, the other thing that's interesting about, especially interesting about it to me, is that when this painting came to the United States in 1851 and was displayed, publicly displayed before thousands of people in New York City and in Washington, D.C., it was a decade before the Civil War erupted. And this was at a time when slavery had emerged as the dominant issue in the national political agenda, one that would, I think most historians would say, be the leading cause of the Civil War that followed a decade later. Now, Leutze was an ardent abolitionist, and you'll notice in the boat next to Washington, to his immediate left, maybe a little hard to see because of the size of the picture, but to Washington's immediate left is a black soldier who I believe is supposed to be a member of the Marblehead Regiment from Massachusetts, which played the lead role in rowing Washington's army across the river that night. These were seafaring men. They had made their living fishing off the banks of Newfoundland in the years before the Revolution. So that regiment, that Marblehead Regiment, was the most ethnically diverse in Washington's army. It was singular in being the only really integrated regiment, I believe, in the Continental Army in 1776. So placing that man in the boat next to Washington, I think, augments the message that Leutze was trying to send to Americans and indeed to people everywhere. He was saying, I believe, that the American Revolution was not just for white people, it was for everyone. If you want to put it in contemporary parlance, I suppose you could say that this was his way of saying Black Lives Matter, only he was saying that 170 years ago when slavery was still widespread in the United States. So this is, I think if you ask most people, this is an image that is first and foremost in their minds when they think about the revolution. Certainly judging from the number of Revolutionary War book covers I've seen, and I've seen quite a few, this seems to be the most popular image, which I think tells you something. But it speaks to the aspirations that I think underlay the revolution. You see it, of course, in the presence of that black gentleman, but also you see it in the fact that you have these, in what was certainly a very hierarchy conscious society in colonial America in the 18th century. You see men of different social classes in the same boat, both metaphorically and literally, in the sense that, they're all pulling together towards a common objective. You see Washington and other officers, but then you also see enlisted men who are manning the oars. And at what was a critical moment in the revolution. And I think what what so resonates with people about this image, what has for generations, is the fact that when it conveys more than any other depiction of the crossing of this critical event, even more so than other more accurate depictions of this event, the emotions of the people that you see. I think it's conveyed in their physical postures and in their facial expressions, their determination, their perseverance, their courage, and their desperation. So in so many ways, I think it symbolizes the revolution, and it symbolizes the aspirational context, if you will, of the revolutionary movement and the founding of our early republic.
Mm-hmm. And it's an important message to us today, isn't it?
I believe it is, especially, at a time when I think that question of what is American democracy is an especially salient one, given the degree of political polarization that exists in our country, and the turmoil that came to the surface quite recently. Of course, five months ago, I believe it was, almost to the day, with the events at the U.S. Capitol, the unprecedented events at the U.S. Capitol, and one of the talking about visual images again. One of the things that most struck me in watching the video of that were the flags. One was the fact that somebody was actually carrying a Confederate flag inside the Capitol. I won't even get into that, but they were also carrying, at least one person, I assume several, were carrying the so-called Gadsden flag, which is the flag, which was a very popular symbol of the revolution when it occurred, and an enduring symbol of it ever since. This is the flag that has the image of the coiled up snake on it that's ready to strike, and underneath are the words, "Don't tread on me." And about a decade or so ago, it became the symbol of the Tea Party movement. So you had people, protesters or rioters, whatever you want to call them, carrying that flag in the Capitol on January 6th. And I assume they were trying to suggest by doing that they were acting in the spirit of the 1776 American patriots. Now, people who are less sympathetic to what they were doing would argue, I'm sure, that the spirit in which they were acting was not so much that of 1776 American patriots, but perhaps more of 1922 Italian black shirts or 1933 German brown shirts. But that's part of the ongoing debate that we're having in our country today.
That's true. And that's why we have to go back and look in the past, don't we? We have to say, what is the origins of this thinking and where did it come from? And isn't there an important anniversary coming up right now?
You mean July 4th?
Yes.
Yes,
No.
which really should be celebrated on July 2nd, but because that was the day that the Continental Congress declared American independence, and then they fine-tuned the text of Jefferson's Declaration after they had declared their independence, so that they would have a document to present to the public, setting forth the reasons why they had declared their independence.
Well, David, we have actually come to the end of our time. We could go on forever. I could see you have so much history behind you. You have so much to offer. People can find you. You lead the tours, don't you, in Princeton on the battlefield?
I lead tours on the Princeton battlefield for the Princeton Battlefield Society, although I haven't actually led one in about a year and a half, but they will be hopefully scheduling those later on this year. I also lead tours at Washington Crossing Historic Park on the Pennsylvania side. And for anyone who's interested, I also have a blog about Revolutionary War related subject matter on my website, and the domain name is DP for David Price, dpauthor.com.
Wonderful.
Thank you for allowing me that moment of shameless self-promotion.
It wasn't shameless. Thank you so much, David Price, for coming on board to Backstory with Joan Goldstein.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.